Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 71 of Relating to DevSecOps, where we explore the development, security, and operational issues of today so we can solve real world problems with people that face them. I'm your host, Ken Toller, and I'm joined again by Mike McCabe, and we are diving directly into one of the largest operational challenges I think that we have as security advisors, personnel, whatever, and that is postmortems or retrospectives or whatever you would like to call it in terms of activities that we take on day to day in incident response or other major security incidents or things that happen. So, Mike, how's it going? We're doing another daytime episode. So the light is bright. The summer has
Yeah,
begun. How are you doing
yeah.
over there?
I'm doing well. You have the tiger polo on, so this is going to be a good episode because you got the red polo on.
Is it? Is it the tiger polo? Is that what we're
Well, it's
calling?
from that's Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec. He always wore the red polo that Tiger Woods wore, something like
I,
that.
I did not realize that. It's actually like it must be the color because that's red behind me, but this is like bright high vis orange. My wife hates this shirt.
Nice. Well, you'll be noticeable on the podcast. Things are good. This topic is relevant, so looking forward to diving in. I think I get the honor of asking you some more questions today than how we normally run things, so I get to dive in.
Sure. Yeah, let's do it. I love talking about postmortems, postmorteming the postmortem process today, probably.
The meta postmortem.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we were chatting before we started, and I think the big question is when have you seen? Well, first off, define postmortem and how it's used, and kind of what's done as a postmortem for folks.
Yeah, I mean, postmortem, retrospective, things like that. It's really the final step when you're closing out an incident or closing out a security task to talk about what you've done, how it succeeded, you could be better, and it's really just a way to reflect without the urgency of an incident or the urgency of a breach or whatever thing that you're dealing with to think about how things could have been better um, if you had done it a different way, and also just to capture lessons learned. We're always learning through our failures, through our mistakes, and I think that anytime you incur an incident, it is a trial by fire, failure recovery, and that is exactly what it is. It's taking that step back. And if you think about some of the discussion that we've had, we've heard Shostak's thing about like what the definition of threat modeling, and it's how can we do it better, and what have we failed at? What have we missed?
Yeah,
Did we do a
pretty
good
good.
job, basically?
Yeah, definitely. Because most people, especially when there's an incident or downtime, people just want to move on. People want to, go back to business as usual. So they're not taking the time to really write down what happened, who was involved, how'd you figure it out, all that stuff. So, also my
Yeah.
favorite term for postmortem, there's after action report, but my favorite one is hot wash. I worked at a bank and people use that term, and I was like, what?
What
What are we
does that
talking about
mean?
here, people?
What does that
It's
mean?
yeah,
That
it's the
just
same
all
thing.
I know is that
Postmortem.
that usually shrinks my clothes.
That's good. Um, so when have you seen postmortems used well? That's the first question.
I mean, I think that any so I think if I can see if a postmortem happens, I think it's like I think you're 90% ahead of most folks. Um, so doing it well is kind of a rarity. Um, and how do you measure well in a postmortem, right? I think it's if you come out of that with any lessons learned or any output, I think that it is something that you've done well. If you have any revelation, um, and you feel like you've asked a question, and you've gotten an answer or an output out of that, I think it's a very similar output to threat modeling. And why we struggle with it is that You don't really know what to expect as an output. And so you kind of go in um, with no expectations. And I think that that is part of the thing that makes it a challenging practice. So to answer your question simply, I think seeing it done well to me means you've executed a postmortem, or you've executed an after action report, or I guess a hot wash as you call it, and you've come out of it with something that will improve your process overall.
Yeah, I think your point is really good that if you're even doing it at all, that's kind of a big step because a lot of people just want to move on. They want to put that trauma of a downtime or a security incident behind them and think about the next thing. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean,
Have you
not
seen
even
any
that.
downsides to? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that it's not even that they don't want to. They want to get on to the next thing. It's just that like they have so many. You have so many priorities that this thing, whatever you need to have a postmortem about, has interrupted all of those activities. So now, on top of having recovered, you have all of these things you need to catch up on, or do, or fix, or because whatever it is that you're having a postmortem about, more than likely, especially if it's an incident, has interrupted your day to day work.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Have you ever seen a downside to doing a postmortem? Anything negative coming out of doing a postmortem?
I don't think that there is a downside. I mean, other than the time it takes to do. But you could argue that if by not having that postmortem or that after action, you are paying with future time. If it's a process that you could have improved or something that you could have done that will help you in the next occurrence, you're going to lose that time in the next occurrence. You'll never improve. I don't think that there's a downside. I'm willing to be wrong. What about you?
What if the whole postmortem was just, it's Johnny's fault? You know, that was just the entire thing.
I think that that more goes into like one of the fundamentals of a postmortem is like ensuring that it's not the blame game.
Yeah.
The goal is to be blameless in these postmortems and to identify inefficiencies or deficiencies in the process.
Yeah.
Somebody may have made a mistake or you may have made a mistake, but the point is that you have to be self-aware enough to understand when the mistakes were made and figure out why that happens. Many mistakes happen in incidents because people aren't prepared, or they're not. They have to think too much when they go through an incident, and so this after action or this postmortem is part of it is to help so that you can do these things without investing too much mental capacity in the middle of an incident on decision making, because a lot of these things are could be made for you, right? They're where to go, who to contact, what process to use, what automation button to click. All those things are things that can be improved upon and lead to mistakes. People have to think too much about them.
Yeah. The only time I can think of a postmortem being bad is when it is not blameless and people, when you get into larger organizations, people are good at playing politics. And so sometimes there's after action reports, postmortems, whatever, they kind of, subtly weigh the blame one way or the other. And sometimes that can turn into teams fighting and, people want to deflect some of the blame. And, so when there's a lot of different stakeholders involved, I've seen that happen because people don't really want the blame to sit squarely on their shoulders. I haven't seen I've been in events where it was literally one person's mistake that brought down production. One person who logged into the wrong database and brought down the entire app. But I haven't seen, a postmortem be like, it's that guy's fault. Yeah. Just like a picture of that developer.
Like the no longer welcome here kind of thing.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I do. I think that there are bad ways to run postmortems in the sense that the goal is to find why it happened, not who to blame. Or the goal is to find. That's why I say the outputs are something that you can use to improve the process. Pointing fingers is not improving the process. If you come out of the postmortem and the result is we know who to blame or we know whose fault it was, that's not a successful postmortem. If you come out of that and you say, well, you know, Mike brought down the entire production database because he logged into the server and he had production access. The question really should be, should you have had access? Should there have been a step for drop tables? Should there have been multi-factor? Should there have been a warning, before the command? Is there a seniority level that we need to have? Should there be a check? Should there be an approval process for these things? Like what is the thing that you could start to tease out, and it becomes almost like a threat model in that way, where you start to think, well, how can we prevent this from happening in the future? Because everybody makes mistakes. People are tired. Maybe they're understaffed. They logged into the wrong server. How do they know it's production? Is it a naming convention thing? All of these things should be, why did it happen, and how can we help prevent that in the future? Beyond that person just needs to not be so bad. Because I think that if we start to think about it in that way, that it makes us less resilient to new hires. It makes us less resilient to process and procedure overall.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've seen some. There's some good public postmortems. I know Cloudflare has. They usually do a pretty good job of doing an in-depth postmortem when they have an outage or an issue. And when you're working at that scale, it's really easy for a small thing to turn into a really big thing. So it's always interesting to read those and figure out, like, okay, how do they solve it? And then what's their long-term fix for the issue? If it's like a process improvement or a completely different technology going to be used, all those kind of things. It's pretty interesting to read those. Have you seen any other good ones? Any other good postmortems people can review to kind of get an idea of what one would look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have the public postmortems when there's a breach or something like that, but it's usually, I mean, we saw that post recently around the joke notification letter around a breach, around just like what you can say to the general public. And it's, the postmortem isn't placating to a narrative or to the general public to say, yeah, we're sorry and we're going to do better. The thing I like about Cloudflare's postmortems, and I can't speak for all of them. I don't know if I've read all of them, but I like to think that at least they have an action that comes out of it, like you said. A lot of the postmortems that I've been involved with have been internal, so I can't really point to any off the top of my head that I can think of that are generally good. But I will say that internally, I think I really like the idea of playbooks being an output. Like, I've always really enjoyed that, because you're always, I think when you go into an incident response program and it's nascent or new or whatever, a lot of times people are like, well, what do we write a playbook for? And what would we do? And they never really have an opportunity to test it. The nice thing about a postmortem is that if you have an output of a playbook of, like, if this were to happen again, what would we do? And top to bottom, it kind of lets you go through that entire process you just went through, identify the gaps, and then address those gaps in that playbook, so that the next time it happens, you actually have a reference to go play by play through that playbook to say, here are the things that I'm doing. And then you might hit a snag along the way, and that will be an iterative process where every time this thing happens, you have a path forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one good output from postmortems is definitely either creating a playbook if you don't have it, or definitely updating it if it's a process related thing. But pretty much
Yeah.
every incident can be traced to some playbook. If it's, code quality thing for, an app vulnerability, or if it's a process based outage, you can always go and make those updates. What is your opinion on when you should do a postmortem? Like, what level of event? Obviously, if there's a breach, if there's like huge downtime, that's probably an easy call. But when do you think there's, like, maybe an in between where a postmortem might be helpful, but it's not like a full on security incident? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think that you can have these postmortems at any scale. Like, it doesn't. I think that when people think of a postmortem, I think it's like, oh, we're going to get the people together, we're going to talk for an hour, and in a lot of cases that is necessary, because you have a lot of different departments, maybe working on a breach notification, or you have comms, you've got marketing, you've got engineering, you've got IT, you've got security. So it makes sense to do something like that. But let's say that like you just experienced a mild outage and you needed to recover uh, like one of the databases or something, and it's a routine process, but something that requires manual intervention. It would be good to say like, hey, this happened again. Is there anything that we can improve, or is this like just going to be routine? And it can take 5-10 minutes. Like, hey, the playbook worked. There wasn't really anything. I felt like it was pretty good, because until it becomes an automated recovery, it's still going to need that postmortem. It's still going to need that activity where you get together and say, how can we improve this, until we actually get to that state where it can be automated, and that manual intervention becomes the um, the exception.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. How when have you seen people kind of sharing those postmortems outside of kind of a lot of times it's like technical groups who get it, dev groups, IT groups, cloud groups, whatever. But when do you see people sharing those kind of more widely, and how do you feel about that? Especially if it's like a security incident. Some people are very, maybe not paranoid, but they don't want to share security issues any wider than they need to be. Besides, like the devs involved, the IT folks involved, and and the security team that's involved. But what are your thoughts there on kind of how transparent you should be with postmortems?
I think as transparent as you can be. Obviously, if it affects your customers, your constituents, I think that you should be public about the things that happen if you can. And that really just that depends on industry. It depends on sensitivity of the data involved, whether it's a routine incident or not. And I think there is the view that you should publish everything that you go through, so that people are aware of what you're doing, how you're doing it, and all of that. Um, but I get both sides of the argument, especially when it comes to like vulnerability fixes, as an example. Like if you have a lot of folks relying on your service or on your site, and then you say, "Hey, we had this vulnerability and it's fixed in version 2, go update this thing. Here's all the things that we've done, and here's the proof of concept, and here's the exploit that we and you give this really detailed postmortem. Well, if someone doesn't update their software or their service or whatever with the latest version, or they're behind, or they're not as on the ball as you are, and they're relying on you, you've just put them at risk, right? So there is a little bit of a balance there, I think, to consider. I would say be as open as you possibly can. And I think, just internalize the fact that you are trying to be as communicative as possible to the folks that are using your service, using your site, or using your software, when you're thinking about making these postmortems public. There are folks that do postmortems every single day. So, I mean, it's going to get pretty long in the tooth if you do it for every single one. So I think that if it becomes an issue where it affects customer data, or it affects the customer, that might be a facet of your vulnerability scoring system, or it might be a facet of your priority rating. Maybe you post all critical or severe or high priority issues. Um, Personally, I think that certainly anything that becomes public, you should have a statement on, and you should be the first to the punch if there's anything that you've gone through that needs to be public. You don't want the news story hitting before you've had a chance to sort of explain or express
Yeah,
what's happened.
yeah. Control the message. Is what you're saying.
I don't want to say control the message, because it's not a narrative thing. It's just it looks better if you say, hey, like, we have an open and honest policy. We fixed the issue. Here's our stance. Here's what we've done. And then the news can pick your story up. And it's like, yeah, we've owned it from the start, rather than the news story picks it up. You have no comment, no comment, no comment. And then you come out with like something to say, and it just looks a little bit worse. On the
Yeah,
back end, that may or may not be indicative of something nefarious happening, or the optics aren't great. But I would never say to do it just to control the narrative, or to control the story. I think that is important, but not for the reasons I think some folks are probably thinking. It's more just
yeah,
to make sure that you're transparent.
yeah, for sure. One other thing I wanted to mention too is that I feel like sometimes out of postmortems, the thing that needs to change that would solve the issue that caused the outage or whatever the incident is, sometimes gets stuck in kind of corporate bureaucracy hell, for lack of a better word. So I think one thing to make sure is, especially if it's a serious issue, make sure that doesn't happen. Don't shove it into like, a board meeting or into a group that gets set up to solve the issue. Like it needs to be actionable and fixed. That might take some time, but don't say we solved the issue by just setting up this working group to solve the issue, and then really nothing might be changing in the short term. But
Yeah, I mean now we're talking about remediation versus the actual postmortem. Like to me, it's like if you come up with the solution, that's where the postmortem happens like after the resolution, you know. So if you are having a
but sometimes the
postmortem before,
resolution takes a long time.
yeah, but at least you have like the resolution. If you're having the postmortem to decide on what the resolution is going to be, I think that that's the wrong output. Like, and I did talk about this a little bit because someone um, we had a discussion with someone recently where there was a question of like when does an incident actually end, right? And when do you mark it as closed or resolved? And I know we're short on time, but I'd be interested in your output on this as maybe like a final word. But my opinion is that the incident is closed. You can close the incident once it's stopped being an incident, meaning that we've isolated it, resolved it, and we have sort of contained the immediate issue. And now we may have a long-term fix that we need to track, which becomes, a high priority working ticket or something else, but to me, related to, but not an incident in and of itself. There are other folks that feel like until we've solved the root problem, the incident isn't over. So I'm just curious about where you fall in that spectrum.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of the point that I was making is I think the bad part is sometimes you have critical incidents and then all the momentum, all the focus on that issue. You're like, all right, we got the threat actor out of the network, we solved the SQL injection, whatever it might be. Like, all right, cool, incident closed. You never get to kind of root cause issue. You set up that working group, whatever it is, and so everyone sighs, for relief because they, solve the critical issue and they don't have data loss or an outage or something. But then you kind of lose that momentum behind actually solving the root cause issue. Maybe that's just bad coding practices. Maybe it's not being multi-region. It's a million different things for a million different issues. But I think that's the issue with kind of closing out an incident too soon is people do kind of want to move on and go back to their day to day and both forget that it happened because incidents suck going through no matter what. But I think that's the problem with closing things too soon. Like, yeah, you close the immediate issue, the security hole, the outage, whatever. But if you don't use the learnings and the momentum from that, the panic that those things cause, and actually change things, you're going to be in the exact same spot again and again. So I think that's where the postmortem has to really turn into how are we making tactical and strategic changes to address these issues moving forward. So that's my final thought.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think it is very much a that and that's why I think folks have that internalization of like the incident's not over. But I think that that's where it becomes if it's a critical issue that root problem is solved, it becomes a new interrupting other ticket, vulnerability, high priority item, whatever it might be. Cool. Well, look, we had very minimal time, but we wanted to cut this episode out and get something over to you folks. We've been wanting to talk about postmortems for a while. Looking forward to hearing any feedback folks might have. A postmortem for our postmortem discussion for any long in the tooth issues. Thank you very much for listening. And Mike, I know you've got a couple of things coming up. Anything you want to announce?
Yeah, if you're in the Northern Virginia area, we're putting on a 3-part conference series. The first one is tomorrow, June 6th. I know it's short notice, but that's at Old Ox. We'll also be in the area July 11th and August 8th. So if you're in the area, check out the cloudsecuritypartners.com website, summer series. link, and hopefully you can join us. Free to go to. We'll have food, drinks, and some interesting speakers as well.
Yeah, sounds like it'll be a good time. Well, thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.